All right. Is this going to work for me? Sure. All right. Okay. Which form did you want? This one? All right, cool. All right, so as I said, we're looking at the war beginning. We talked about this group of Maryland infantrymen in camp in 1861. All right, so Northern advantage is you have an industrial market economy, lots of factories. We talked about Lowell and Slater. Lowell mills are producing a crazy amount of textiles, and as I said, like outproducing the South by Lowell itself outproducing the South by almost 90% of textile output. So 90% of the nation's industrial output is coming from northern states. Those commercial ports are also not going to be not only great for trade and the movement of goods, but those northern ports are going to lead to high shipping costs that also kind of pull the South into the war as well. The northern ports are also going to allow for a lot of shipbuilding. The production of naval ships is going to be pretty tremendous during this period of time, because once the war gets started, the federal government is going to commission the building of these ships, and they go from a wooden navy to an ironclad navy, not overnight, that's a little drastic, but over the course of the first year of the war, they start moving toward ironclad ships. And we'll talk about that early ironclad battle, Battle of Hampton Roads versus the Monitor and the Merrimack a bit later. The North has a larger population, more manpower for the Army and the Navy. They have a larger and stronger Navy. Remember, their Army and Navy cut their teeth in the Mexican War. Naval output, as I said, due to the ports, gives them an advantage. They had an already established and relatively powerful central government led by Abraham Lincoln. And I want to make a note here, and you can jot this down if you'd like. Keep in mind that once the Confederate states secede, there's only one Democrat from the seceding Confederate states that sticks around in Congress, and that guy's Andrew Johnston, who will be Lincoln's second vice president. So think about this mass exodus of the Southern Democrats. So what does that mean? Who controls Congress and the Senate? Republicans, right? Now, it's not a fairy tale relationship between Lincoln and Congress or Lincoln and his cabinet, but the party controls the House and the Senate. All right, additional support of liberated runaway slaves from the South. Yeah, obviously that doesn't make up the majority of Northerners, but as you guys brought up earlier, you know, we didn't even talk about this in the response that you guys had. Did anybody talk about the Emancipation Proclamation in their response?
I said it.
Okay, yeah, so you talked, good job, Gavin and Jackson. So the deal there is this. Even though slavery is not illegal per se, there is going to be a movement to enlist African Americans into the military. And that's going to be a significant number. You're looking at like 350,000 eligible soldiers. Not to mention contraband, which we're going to talk a little bit about later. Contraband are basically like slaves that are absorbed into armies, and they're not they're kind of like in limbo. They're not free, but they're not enslaved any longer, and then they're kind of like working with the army. It was not a great option or opportunity always, but it was better than what they had experienced, where they were before. Obviously, better weapons technology thanks to Industrial North, Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts. Not to mention, you've got with the interchangeable parts all of these different weapons manufacturers that are going to be using interchangeable parts, like Samuel Colt. Let's see, we've got the Federal Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Federal Arsenal at Springfield, and there are other like private people that are producing weapons. You also have the British Enfield that's produced, but as much of the more Enfield wound up in the hands of the Union, but the British also managed to get Enfields in the hands of the Confederates as well. So that's a little bit of a dicey scenario that we're going to talk a little bit about here shortly. What's up? Yeah. Yeah, Claude Monet, the mini ball. Yeah, very good. We're going to talk about the mini ball. It revolutionizes warfare, but it also like revolutionizes tactics. Like it makes the Napoleonic tactics like obsolete because it was so deadly. Michelle.
When you were listening to the Revolutionary War, when was it that they put the spiral?
The rifled muskets are going to start. So this is all really great discussion here. The rifled musket starts during the Revolutionary period, but the bullet was still a round ball. It is the combination of the rifled musket and the mini ball, which is actually not a ball, it is a cylinder, combustible cylinder bullet with grooves that is going to provide for a much deadlier accuracy in this war. So good point, Michelle. Good point, Gavin. Andrew, what's up, buddy?
At what point did they stop using the flintlocks? Because at this point they had the primer.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of tough to like really put your. Some people are going to continue to use them throughout the war, but if you were like issued a Enfield or a Springfield, if you went away from like, because a lot of these guys show up with their own weapons, but between like smuggling and between like government issued, either federal or Confederate issued guns, then like they're going to use the caps and they're going to get away from that. So, but were there people still using that style by the end of the war? I'm sure there were. I'm sure it wasn't like completely done away with, but basically, like to sort of like answer your question, I think the North had pretty much moved away from that. I think you're going to still see Southerners using it, but I think what you're also going to have to think about is in Richmond, Fayetteville, in Atlanta, other places, they're replicating the Springfield. Like Richmond made a Springfield style rifle. We'll see it at Tredegar when we go visit. And that, once those are produced and once they get out and issued, not to mention the fact, if you win a battle, you're probably going to go pick the battlefield for weapons. So I think over time, as soldiers have more availability to more advanced hammer and ignition mechanisms, they're going to move away from the flintlock.
Okay. Also, was there much standardization in all sizes?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a really good question. They were standardized, but we'll actually look at the one caliber that is like they try to make one caliber completely standard, so it could be used, universally. Yeah, that's a really great question. All right, so I got a little pie chart for you. That's your population breakdown. Roughly 9 million Confederates, 4 million of which are slaves, and then you've got about 22 million folks in the Union, and we could do more, like, we could slice the population breakdown even more for male, female, if you want to check that out. I can get you some links for that. They weren't, but some women will serve. But women win wars on the home front. You know, it would have been impossible to fight this war if women weren't serving in other capacities. So we are going to delve into the role of women in the war. Some women did serve. But they undercover. Sort of. We'll talk. Sure. So there were some women on the Confederate and Union side that actually enlisted under assumed names.
Wait, I thought you were talking about they served in the capacity of battlefield nurses.
That too. Spies, nurses, factories, farms. We'll get into that. All right, let's take a look at some northern disadvantages. They had to invade foreign territory with a lack of knowledge of the southern geography. Most maps of the North were out of date. In fact, when Fremont lost his command in the West and Halleck gained it, Halleck had to go to a local general store to pick up maps. That was how he was in bad shape. I mean, that was how out of date Union maps were. And that's also, the maps have a lot to say about the naming of battles. Some battles have two names, Bull Run and Manassas. So, like, typically, so typically what, we'll talk a bit about this later, but, you know, one thing that the North would do is try to take a geographic feature and say, all right, this battle is named for, so Bull Run's running through, they know that creek can't change. So, Battle of Bull Run. Whereas the Confederates, they're defending Manassas, Battle of Manassas. Shiloh's another example. Shiloh was named for a church nearby the battlefield. Named Battle of Shiloh, but it's also known as the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing as well, which was along the river. So, and there's some battles we're going to learn about that have like 5 names. It's kind of crazy. All right, so the southern climate in disease was a problem. One case in particular that we're going to learn early on, we're going to learn about the Peninsula Campaign. Are y'all familiar with the Peninsula Campaign? Started in March of 1862, and it went all the way into the summer, and malaria was a huge problem. Same deal occurred in the exact same period of time in the Western Theater during the Corinth Campaign and the Battle of Shiloh. A lot of the soldiers on both sides came down with malaria and got sick with yellow fever during the battle. And you have to think about the fact that these guys are marching, you know, on the low end 10 to 20 miles a day, and on the high end like 30 to 35 miles a day on foot. So the fatigue and the illness creep into to being a pretty big problem for the Union Army. Obviously, disease is going to be a problem for the Confederates as well, and we'll talk more about disease as a problem moving forward. Disease will take more lives on both sides of the war than any bullet. Inefficient generals early in the war, George B. McClellan. Some people would freak out by me saying that because McClellan was wildly popular. He was also a brilliant tactician. He graduated second in his class at West Point. I believe he's class of 1846. You think he's in the same class as Jackson? We'll have to look back at that. Somebody look that up for me.
Did he get fired?
Several times. Yeah. So here was McClellan's brilliance. He was beloved by his men, but he was also like, he had them more, what class? McClellan. Oh, I thought you looked it up for me.
I am trying to.
George B. McClellan. I think he's class of 1846 from West Point. Pretty sure it's the year that Jackson graduated. So McClellan was a brilliant tactician. Is it 46? Yeah. So he's a brilliant tactician. The men love him. He's always like, his men are ready for battle. The problem is, McClellan's slow to move, right? And he always thinks that the army's bigger than what it is. And he gets even more shook when Lee takes command after Joseph E. Johnston is wounded at 7 Pines. So McClellan, I do want to give him some credit here. He had some brilliant strategy, and he was a popular commander, but he didn't always get it done on the battlefield. Similarly with Ambrose Burnside. Burnside should have never left the coastal blockade. He was great at commanding the coastal blockade, but he flew up the ranks for a couple of reasons. He was politically connected. He also developed a breech-loading carbine that got him pretty famous as well. And it's called the Burnside carbine. He makes his way up the ladder, and he winds up in command of the Union Army during the Battle of Fredericksburg, and it's a bloodbath. He just senselessly and blindly sends soldiers to their death at Fredericksburg, and his tactics on the battlefield were atrocious, and they cost the Union Army a lot of lives and the loss of a lot of territory in the first 2 years of the war. So when I'm talking about early on, McClellan and Burnside, I'm talking about 61 and 62. Now, some people would say, well, wait, McClellan had a pretty big victory in what is now West Virginia early in the war. He did. He did have early victories, and that's what propelled him to get that job. But as Gavin brought up, he's going to lose his command twice because he is so slow to move on a smaller army. Lincoln will say, if George B. McClellan does not want to use the army, I'd like to borrow it. Because McClellan always wanted more troops. He always wanted more time. Burnside, it's crazy. Even after he lost the command of the Army of the Potomac, he regained the command toward the end of the war. And Burnside, for his last command, which I'm not going to get that far into, it's a command that he had at Petersburg. He's actually lucky he didn't wind up in a situation where he could have been like court-martialed. So we'll talk about that later on. So to win the war, the North had to fight a largely offensive war. This is a difficult strategy to fight on foreign land. I know that's kind of silly when they're like, all right, foreign land, but the Confederate states, the Southern Territory, was foreign to most of these soldiers fighting in the North, a lot of which had never been much farther than outside their hometown, or rarely even outside of their home state. There's Little Mac, there's George B. McClellan on the left, there's General Burnside. That's the reason we got sideburns, because of Burnside. That's where we get like some weird little like names through the Civil War that like stick around in our culture. So we'll talk about that. Yeah, good point.
Was McClellan before Burnside?
Yes, well, Little Mac, so this is the carousel that was the Army of the Potomac. This actually connects to disadvantages. So Winfield Scott wanted Lee to have command. Lee didn't take it. So it goes from Winfield Scott to Irvin McDowell to McClellan to John Pope, but then back to McClellan. Then from McClellan to Joe Hooker to, no, I'm sorry, McClellan to Burnside to Hooker to Meade to Grant. So that's just the Army of the Potomac. And then we see a similar thing occur in the Western Theater for the Confederate Army. Albert Sidney Johnston's killed at Shiloh, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and I'll go through that progression of generals in a second. All right, so Southern advantages, they're fighting on their home turf most of the time. Only a handful of battles are fought outside of the Confederate States. So we've got some big ones like Antietam and Gettysburg, but we also have like little skirmishes like outside of Baltimore and Carlisle, PA, and Glorieta Pass, New Mexico. Like there are battles outside of where we're thinking, like Virginia out to Missouri and Texas. Really strong generals early in the war. Robert E. Lee, even though they called him Granny Lee in his first campaign in Western Virginia, he takes over for Joseph E. Johnston after the Battle of Seven Pines in the Peninsula Campaign, and that Johnston's army under Lee's command will be renamed the Army of Northern Virginia. Thomas J. Jackson, he was a corps commander under Joseph E. Johnston, becomes corps commander under Lee. He'll serve as Lee's sort of like right-hand man all the way till Chancellorsville, where he's wounded. In fact, Lee says Jackson has lost his left arm and I've lost my right. And then Jeb Stuart, by far the most talented cavalry general in the early portion of the war. He will be checked and matched by 1863. The Union cavalry got stronger as the war went on. They started putting the right people in command, like John Buford, Alfred Pleasanton, and a few others. But Stuart was just head and shoulders above all other cavalry commanders. But his main vice was he was a very vain general. He liked to read about himself in the newspaper. And yeah, he didn't smoke, he didn't drink, he didn't gamble. But man, he loved himself. So Stuart got himself into trouble because he wanted to make the papers. So in order to make the papers in the Civil War, you got to do some crazy stuff. So he would do crazy things like ride around the entire Union Army in the Peninsula Campaign, or launch these crazy daring attacks on Union cavalry and infantry. And it ultimately gets him and the Confederate Army in a lot of trouble because he gets checked for the first time at Brandy Station in 1863, and in spite of that, he says, "You know what? I'm gonna get one back. I'm gonna win one back," and goes on this crazy ride toward Carlisle instead of giving Lee the eyes and ears that he needed to know that troops were moving along the ridge toward Gettysburg. And he shows up to Gettysburg late for that very reason. What's up?
Stonewall Jackson, he was a hypochondriac.
Totally.
He
crazy in warfare. Yeah.
He was a hypochondriac where I think he, like, at one point during the war, he had to go on a diet of, like, just strawberries. And he refused to read sitting down, so, like, he would stand up reading his Bible for hours because he thought that would hold the organs to a more natural position. And,
You're right.
And then he would ride into battle with his hand like held high because he thought that would make better blood flow.
Yeah, he went into battle with his left arm up, and he thought that the blood flow could help him think better in battle. And he actually got shot in the hand at Bull Run. But that's not the same wound that he received at Chancellorsville where he got shot through the left arm. But it just nicked him and barely did anything. But Sandy Pendleton and his other cabinet members like Cod Douglas and those guys at Bull Run, where he got his name, which we'll talk about that later, they were they couldn't believe it. They were freaked out. Bullets are flying, bombs are dropping, and everybody's trying to keep it together, and he's just sitting there, with the left arm up, and then he also had quirky things where sometimes he would only eat peaches in battle, sometimes he would only eat lemons. Yeah, he was unintended. So early on, another thing about this too, guys, you have generals that are more familiar with the terrain. One thing that I want to add there too is that all three of these generals had a group of partisans working for them. Do you all know what partisans are? Partisans are kind of like ranking spies. They're trusted spies. They understand. They're not spies that are working for a payday. They're not like privateers, which that was a problem during the war. They're actually fighting for a particular side, but they're doing it undercover. So they actually had a group of privateers and spies that were working for them. The most famous is a guy we'll learn about later. His name's John Singleton Mosby, and he was a spy throughout the Northern Virginia and parts of the Shenandoah Valley. Early on, the Confederates had better horsemen and more marksmen. At the start of the war, at least, many mustered with their own weapons and horses. Do you understand what mustered is? Yeah, they're brought up. Good. So yeah, we're not talking about sandwich spread here. We're talking about these people coming together to fight. So a lot of them, to answer Andrew's question before, they're showing up with their weapons and they're showing up on their own horses in many cases. And like some of these folks, like hunting was a way of life for them. It's not that it was, let me phrase this, the same was going on for many Northern soldiers, but not proportionally the same as the Southern soldiers, because most Southern soldiers are coming from rural areas. All right, so to win the war, they had to wear the North down, keep them out of the Confederate capital. The Confederate capital, after Virginia secedes in April 19th, 1861, following the events of Fort Sumter, Virginia, they'll move the capital from Montgomery to Richmond. It's kind of like Washington and the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, and that's how they see it. And has anybody ever seen the Confederate seal before? Nobody's ever seen it? Let's take a look at the Confederate seal a bit later. Actually, look it up. Tell me what you see on it. Who is that dude? Here we have Lee, Jackson, Stewart. Yeah. Isn't that wild? Yeah. So, yeah, it's Washington on the seal. All right. Check out the Southern disadvantages. We got a bit of a laundry list here. Smaller population, smaller army, smaller navy, smaller economy, little industrialization. Richmond and Birmingham were your only major ironworks. Gavin brought up Atlanta before, Fayetteville, North Carolina, Danville, Virginia, Memphis, New Orleans, Nashville, Montgomery, Charleston, a little bit. Richmond, hands down Richmond. Richmond's one of the biggest industrial. Richmond kept the Confederacy in the war. Without Tredegar, the way it was run, the war would not have lasted as long as it did. That's why I want us to go take an opportunity to visit Tredegar together this year. Fewer resources. Despite key meetings held, as I mentioned before, in New Orleans and Memphis and other major cities, one of which was held in Charleston, one was held in Richmond, the South couldn't get the industrialization going. What did industrialization require? Interconnected railroads, interconnected telegraph systems. Now those improved. In fact, you have to give the South some credit here that it doesn't get. In the decade prior to the war, from 1850 to 1860, the South does lay more railroad track and does lay more telegraph lines than they had previously in the previous 20 years. But it's not enough to catch up. Does that make sense? They had to develop a developing central government. A lot of aversion to central power, right? A lot of these Confederate states did not want to come in to the Union to a new union, right? And one of the earliest states to threaten to secede was Georgia over conscription. What's conscription? Very good, Donovan. It is a draft. They weren't too thrilled about that. And the guy that is going to back Georgia is going to be the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, who was a Georgian. And like, you have that mentality. That mentality does not leave these guys in the Confederacy. They're like, I'm a Georgian first, a Confederate second, a Virginian first. Like, yeah, I will not turn my sword against my native state. So he's a Virginian first. Yeah. Class problems continued between small farmers and lower class artisans, planters, and merchants. In fact, another really unpopular law was passed in the Confederacy saying that if you have a certain amount of slaves, the number being 20, you could be, omit yourself from conscription. So if you owned a number of slaves, you were basically, I'm trying to think of the right word that I want to use here. You were exempt from the draft, right? But that, so like, there are people who are like, wait a minute, I have to own 20 slaves to be exempt from the draft? Why am I fighting this war? This is where you start to get a rich man's war, poor man's fight mentality. And that happens in 1862. So that becomes real, like both that law and the conscription law. And I don't know if you realize this, but the Confederates beat the Union, beat the North to the conscription, the draft. Yeah.
Okay, what do you watch behind that? Like, from what I see, and I could be thinking about this, but it could be wrong angle, but and it's sort of playing devil's advocate. But if you own 30 some odd slaves, it could make more sense for you to go off to war because your land and your farm and all are being handled, versus some other dude who's like, I got this one guy and it's me and my family. Right.
Well, the mentality like that, this has like been grappled with in history for a long time, because it's like, well, if you look at it on the side of like, oh well, if you own 20 or more slaves, those slaves need to be tended to, so to speak, instead of just free. So that's how they looked at it. But then there's also the thing of like, oh, this is a way for wealthy people to get out of the war, right? The same thing occurs in the North, though. We'll talk about later. There were ways for you to buy your way out of the draft in the Union. So that became a point of contention, and it actually leads to a draft riot in New York in 1863. And it's really sad and messed up because that draft riot had to be stopped by soldiers that marched from Gettysburg after that battle was over. They were the ones that stopped the riot. You guys have probably seen, anybody seen Gangs in New York? Anybody seen it? Yeah, I've shown you a clip. I wanted to keep my job though, so I had to stop it. But the very end of Gangs of New York deals with the draft, the New York City draft riots. It was like, it was a mess. It was like a draft riot, a race war, and a gang fight all wrapped up into one of 2 days of like bloodshed in the streets of New York. It was nuts. It was crazy. So, here we go, moving right along. Weak currency backed by cotton. Very little specie, guys. Very little gold and silver for the Confederacy to back their money with. They also looked at this as a way to like, you know, oh, we got leverage. We're going to use our cotton as leverage. But what they weren't anticipating was that their cotton was going to be replaced by cotton growing in other places in the world. And it also kicks up, which you guys have probably learned about in years past, it kicks up that British colonial movement in India, right? The Western Army, weaker than the Eastern Army, this similar deal. They have a really solid commander at the beginning of the war. In fact, he was the most experienced. He's not the highest ranking. The highest ranking Confederate was not actually Robert E. Lee. The highest ranking Confederate Union general to go into the Confederacy was Joseph E. Johnston. Now I'm going to confuse you. The most experienced general going into the war was Albert Sidney Johnston. Okay? Albert Sidney Johnston had fought in the Texas Revolution and the Western Indian Wars, had served in the Mexican War, had served against the Comanche and the Apache. If there was something to fight in, he was in it. It's crazy. But what happens to Albert Sidney Johnston is, at the Battle of Shiloh, a bullet goes through his boot, severs an artery, and he bleeds out. So now we have like another carousel where it's like a similar to what was going on in the East. So Albert Sidney Johnston dies. Thank you. He's replaced by Albert Sidney Johnston's replaced by P.G.T. Beauregard. P.G.T. Beauregard is replaced by Braxton Bragg. Braxton Bragg is replaced by Joseph E. Johnston, who was lucky he wasn't dead. Joseph E. Johnston was replaced again by Braxton Bragg. Braxton Bragg was then replaced by John Bell Hood. John Bell Hood was then replaced by Joseph E. Johnston again. So, same deal. It's crazy, right? It's quite the carousel. So what's going on for the Union and the Army of the Potomac in the East is going on for the Army of the Tennessee, Confederate Army in the West. Okay? All right, and then the last disadvantage that we're going to look at is the breaking up of the border states, or the splintering of the border states. West Virginia secedes from Virginia in 1861, and then you have 4 slave border states that do not secede with the Confederacy: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. These create border wars within the Civil War. Here we have Tredegar, which we'll check Tredegar out later this year. Tredegar is going to be the main producer of iron and weapons for the Confederate Army. So let's take a look at general strategies of the war, and then I'm going to pump the brakes for the day. The Union adopted Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan from the start of the war. They wanted to strangle out all Confederate trade along the Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Mississippi. If something could float on it, they wanted to block it. Any river they could block. The Confederacy wanted to maintain control of all major southern ports, cities, forts, and wear the Union down. The Union also planned to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, but to also, and I want you to make note here, take as many Confederate state capitals as they possibly could. One area both sides didn't pay attention to initially was the West. Guerrilla warfare broke out there in 1861. Technically, we could put that back to 1856 because the Kansas-Nebraska Bleeding Kansas events kept on going. Beyond the Mississippi River, Confederacy allied itself with Native American tribes. I provided you guys a list of tribes that sided with the Confederates: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Catawba, Creek. All fought on the Confederate side. Do those tribes look familiar? Okay. What did all those tribes endure? Exactly. They all endured the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. And that's why they ended. This is not going to bode well for them by the end of the war. All right. This is a good place for us to pump the brakes for today. There's Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, Scott's Great Snake, and we're going to learn about how the Anaconda Plan went into effect. Yes.